Ever wondered how podcasts actually work or what they are? Yeah, I'm going to explain it today. We're talking about RSS feeds. We'll be back in a second. All right, we're talking about RSS feeds. We're talking about podcasts. We're talking about the technical stuff that goes on behind the scenes that happens when you publish an episode of your show. I'm Dan Benjamin. Welcome to the channel. I want to remind you before we dive in too much, please like, subscribe, ring the bell. This is how you can say to me, I like what you're doing. Do more of it. It's also how you can tell YouTube that you like what I'm doing, and it helps promote the show. So do that. And I'll keep showing up and making these videos for y'all because I really like this. Now let's get into it. What is a podcast? In its essence, a podcast is really two things. It's an RSS feed that contains the data about your podcast and the episodes, and it's the MP3 files that people are going to listen to. You need both of those things to make a podcast. You probably know this, but there's a good chance that you don't really know what an RSS feed is or how it works. So to understand that, you just need to understand what RSS is, and it's actually pretty simple. RSS stands for Real Simple Syndication, and this is a technology that's been used for many, many years for news websites and any kind of website that's publishing data. It's also creating something called an RSS feed, which is essentially an XML file with the RSS spec. And an XML file, if you've ever looked at HTML code, if you've ever viewed source on a website, then you're looking at HTML. HTML is a kind of an XML file, actually. The RSS spec or format for that file determines what comprises an RSS feed. Now, again, you're not really meant to look at an RSS feed file or an XML file for that matter. That is meant from one machine to generate so that another machine or another piece of software can read that and understand what to do with it. It's not meant to be human readable, right? And so that's why these things look strange. And one of the questions I get when I'm doing support for Fireside.fm, someone will say, I clicked the subscribe link and this code showed up in my browser. That's not right. That's not what people want to see. There's something wrong. There's nothing wrong. You're looking at the raw RSS feed, which is just, it's code for all intents and purposes, and you're not meant to see it. But computer systems, software, and podcast apps know exactly what to do with it. They read that in, they get the information that they need about your episode and about your podcast, and that's how they know how to display it and where to go and find those MP3 files to play to your listeners. It's pretty simple. The RSS feed, another way to think of it is that it's the beating heart of your podcast, because that's where all of the information comes. And that RSS feed is automatically generated by your podcast hosting software. Hopefully you're using Fireside.fm. I'm a little biased thinking that maybe that's the best one out there, but it doesn't matter. Your podcast host is what's generating that RSS feed, and that lives on your podcast host on their service, and it's being sent out anytime that somebody requests an update. Have you updated your show? Have you added a new episode? So all of those services out there, whether it's Apple Podcasts or Overcast or Pocket Casts or Spotify or Stitcher or wherever your podcast has been disseminated and distributed to, all of those services and apps are connecting to your podcast host and requesting that file, that RSS feed, that XML file. That's what contains the data about your podcast. So if you have 1 million listeners listening to your show, that means you're going to have 1 million requests, maybe every few minutes, maybe every hour, maybe once a day, depending on the service, that's going to try and connect to that XML file, that RSS feed, and say, anything new? And if there's nothing new in there, it says, nope, no new episodes. But when that file changes, which happens when you publish a new episode or make a change to an episode, those services are supposed to say, oh, there's that, something changed, something happened, here's a new episode, and then they download that MP3 file and let you hear it. In the case of some of those services like Spotify that rehost your files, so if you've submitted your podcast to Apple Podcasts, they don't do anything with hosting. When somebody subscribes via the podcast app, they're getting redirected back to your RSS feed itself. They're not talking to Apple Podcasts anymore. They're now talking directly to your feed that you host on your podcast service. Spotify is a little different. Stitcher is a little different. They rehost your MP3 files. So while they're still going out there to check on that RSS feed to see if it's been updated, when an MP3 file has been released, they download it and rehost it. That can be pretty good because they're guaranteeing a quality of service to their users. They're making sure that that file stays available. And Spotify, for example, has a wonderful CDN that spans the whole globe. And so that everybody downloading their file from Spotify is going to get it fast and it's going to be great. The downside to that is, and this is kind of a tangent, but if you've ever caught a mistake in your episode, rebounced it and exported it. And by the way, I have a video about how to export MP3s in the best way possible. And also another video on what a download is. Go check those out. Maybe there's a card up there somewhere if I remembered to do it. Then in that case, you're downloading it directly from your podcast host. But in the case of Spotify, Stitcher, and some of the other ones, they're rehosting that file. So if you've updated it, they have no way of knowing that you've updated that file. And that's why sometimes when you made a change, it's not reflected in every other podcast service because there's no way for them to know to go and rehost that file unless you make other changes to the episode, which causes the data to be changed in your RSS feed, which causes them to re-download the episode and update that MP3 file. Again, a little technical, but it's important for you to understand this because one of the questions that we really get asked a lot is, I updated my MP3 file, but I'm still hearing the old one. Why? And I say, what service? And they say, oh, it's on Stitcher, it's on Spotify. And that's the answer. You need to have updated data in your RSS feed for it to be picked up. And sometimes you can accomplish that by updating the published at date. Sometimes you can change it by changing the title or the description. It all depends on the service and how particular they are about knowing when to look for a change in your RSS feed. But again, it all comes down to that RSS feed. Now, here's another thing you need to know is if you ever wanted to switch podcast hosts, let's say you realize that Fireside's the best, you want to switch over. I'm just picking Fireside arbitrarily. It could be anyone, but you realize that you want to switch to another better host. In that case, then what you're of course going to do is set up something called a 301 redirect. That's basically when you forward your mail, you've moved from one house to another house and you tell the post office, forward all my mail. That's essentially what a 301 redirect is doing, except it's doing it for your RSS feed. It's saying in your old host, I'm not here anymore. Send the traffic over to this new place. And the 301 redirect is called 301 redirect because essentially behind the scenes, the web server is giving a 301 code to what in this case isn't a web browser, really. It's a podcast application. It's a podcast client. It's a service that says, no, nothing to see here. Go over here now and go get the RSS feed and files over at this new location. So that's why it's so important when you're leaving one service or changing your host that you make sure that they support a redirection, a 301 redirection, so that you can take all of your listeners with you and point them at that new RSS feed. Very important. Another question I'm always asked is, how often does a service or an app actually pull my RSS feed? And what's interesting is that actually is dependent upon how popular your podcast is and based on how that service wants to reflect those changes. So one of the biggest questions I get is, I just published a new episode and it still hasn't shown up in Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever. The reason is, unless you have a very, very popular show, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, they might only check your RSS feed once a day, once in a 24-hour time period. And if you think about how many podcasts there are out there, there are millions. So it would be unreasonable for those services to check and see if you've updated your feed along with all the millions of others. There would never be enough time in a day for those podcast services to do that. So instead, they check periodically. But the more popular your podcast is within that service, in other words, the more people that have liked and subscribed to it, the more frequently it will check and display that information. Now, it's different if you're using a podcast app. Your podcast app on your phone is talking directly to that podcast's RSS feed, typically. Some services do some caching and have a central server to report to instead, but many of them are talking directly to your RSS feed and pulling data directly from it. They're not dependent on their own caching or service, so you might see a download happen faster in some apps than others. Every app is different and there are no rules. Remember, this is still the Wild West out here in podcasting. So that's basically the concept of an RSS feed and how it works. But I want to actually show you what an RSS feed really looks like so that you have a really good idea. And if you ever wanted to, you can examine an RSS feed yourself and understand what's happening. So let's take a look. What you see here is an RSS feed. It happens to be one for the amazing podcast called Very Bad Wizards, hosted by a couple of my friends and, of course, hosted on Fireside. And this is the Raw RSS feed, the kind of thing that you probably would never want to look at if you're a sane, rational human being. But we don't care about that. We're trying to understand, so we're going to do it. If you start looking at this, if you've ever seen, like I mentioned before, if you've ever seen HTML code before, you probably are seeing some similarities between this RSS feed file, which is XML, and HTML. You're seeing opening and closing tags, and you probably already have an idea of what's going on with this file. Look at this title tag. The title of the podcast is Very Bad Wizard. So you can see that right there. And this is contained inside of this channel block right here. So the channel block is talking about things in the channel, or what we would call a podcast. You can see the description. You can see the language. You can see that it's episodic. Now you can see the word iTunes here. These are special iTunes tags that Apple created that contain special information just for iTunes, which is now called Apple Podcasts, but they haven't changed the tag names, fortunately. But you can see this information is contained here. It's typically the same information that you would see on a website or within Apple Podcasts or your podcast player. And in fact, it's so ubiquitous now, these iTunes tags, that pretty much all software supports them. Even though they say iTunes doesn't matter, they're there in every podcast. And so typically they are read by every service. So you can also see the Apple Podcast categories here as I scroll down. And then you'll see this tag here is an item. And you'll notice I'm looking at this, by the way, in Chrome. And you can use certain browsers to view RSS feeds. Chrome, Brave are some that do it by default. If you're opening it up in Safari, Safari will say, I don't want to display that. I'm going to send you to a newsreader application to view this. So you have to use certain browsers in order to be able to see the RSS feed. But you'll notice here that this item, you can open and close it, and that just sort of toggles the visibility of the item in the Chrome browser anyway. And you can see here, there is the title of this particular episode. There is the link to it. And here's something called a GUID, G-U-I-D, which stands for Globally Unique Identifier. And right way on Fireside, you can see that this is a 32-character string that is supposed to be unique in the entire world. There is no other string just like this one. There are a lot of other hosting providers that don't generate guaranteed to be unique identifiers. They actually might just use the URL of the episode or something. And the reason that that you will sometimes find a string like this instead of just the URL to the episode is because if you were to ever move to another provider, those GUIDs shouldn't be tied to a specific URL. They shouldn't be a specific URL. They should be completely independent and completely unique across the entire world, across the universe. And that makes moving easier. For example, if those GUIDs aren't preserved and you move to another provider, your listeners might re-download every single one of those episodes because the GUIDs have changed. They changed when you changed your URL, or they changed when you changed your host. I tried to be smart when I was building Fireside so that if you have a GUID, we just import your GUID from wherever you were hosting and use that, and that prevents those double downloads that you might see in some cases. The next most important tag to look at here is the enclosure, which contains a URL. Now you can see here that these guys are using Chartable to track some of their stuff. And then they're here doing the actual download. This long string is the URL to download the MP3 file directly from Fireside. You'll see there's also a length specified and the type of file that it is. The length is used by the podcast apps, players, and services to determine exactly how long that file is. And you can see there's some iTunes specific codes and information here. There's the duration listed there as well. all of this is here for those readers. You can see down here, again, if you're familiar with HTML, you can see there's HTML embedded in here. And that's what's going to allow some podcast apps, but not all, to accurately display your links and your show notes and things like that. Not all of them do that. And the ones that don't, shame on them, because you really should be able to show your show notes across every app. And all it is HTML, so they should let you render it. The last thing I'll mention in here is sometimes in an RSS feed for a podcast, you'll see additional tags, maybe ones that you don't even recognize. That's because RSS spec is something that you can expand upon if you want. And in this case, there are a couple of Fireside specific codes. That's because some of our customers have wanted to do things like automatically embed a player and pull that data right out of the RSS feed. So I went ahead and added my own Fireside spec, which you can do, and that spec is hosted, so anyone can use it. And I have something like the built-in player URL and even a player embed. So if you were a developer and you were building a site, you could pull this RSS feed and you could get the code that you need to embed a player right from within the RSS feed itself. So that's what's involved there. And you can even see here, this link right here at the top, that's where I define what that spec is. So pretty cool. But this is the gist of an RSS feed. So if you ever wind up seeing one of these things on your screen, you click a link and it opens up and you're like, what's this? Well, now you know. So that's it. Hopefully now you understand a little bit more about what an RSS feed actually is and how a podcast works behind the scenes. And if you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, ring the bell. And that's it. I'm Dan Benjamin. Thanks for watching.